First, for those that do not know Deloitte, between our consulting, tax, and audit practices, we serve over 75% of the Fortune 500 retailers. We're honored to be in our 5th year as a conference presenter, our 3rd year as a board member, and planning the 3rd semester of our joint senior capstone course. We are impressed each year with the university's ongoing diligence to providing innovative teachings to the future of retailing, as well as a collaborative forum for the broader retailing network. In facing the shifting economy and post-bubble burst, Deloitte is focused on staying aware, responsive, and proactive. As part of Deloitte Research, Carl Steidtman provides leadership and advisement, not only on the economic environment, but more importantly, the impacts of the retail industry. Carl is a nationally recognized expert on forecasting of consumer, technology, investment, and general economic trends. Dr. Steidtman works with individual clients in assessing the impacts of the economic, demographic, political, and technological changes on their business strategies. His research has been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, USA Today, and the New York Times, among other publications. As well, he has appeared on the McNeil-Lear NewsHour, CNBC, and the Nightly Business Report. All of these things are what make Carl both well-qualified and personally requested by the university for a 2nd consecutive Global Retailing Conference appearance. However, it is my opinion his unique ability to create transparency, relevance, and spirit in his presentation is what makes us lucky to hear him today. May I proudly introduce Dr. Carl Steidtman.
Thank you. Well, good morning. God, it is a great morning. I couldn't believe it walking over here. I live in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, and when I left home on Tuesday, it was snowing about an inch an hour, and to come here now is really a fabulous experience. We live in an age of great transformation. We're seeing a transformation of the economy that is really unprecedented in our lifetimes. Every recession has an impact on the economy. You could almost say every recession does change the economy in some way. But this recession is really much more so than any other recession we've seen before. Things really are, more different today than they've ever been before. We're seeing a transformation of the financial services industry, an increase in regulatory oversight, an expansion of government, a contraction of the retail sector and consumer business, a change in the international relationships between the US and the rest of the world, a transformation of the healthcare system, a transformation of energy. And in the midst of all of that, we have to figure out a way to make money and to carry on with the business of the day. Let me start off with a quote from John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was a fascinating character, a bit eccentric, a child prodigy, played several musical instruments, spoke Latin and Greek at a very young age, was a philosopher and an economist. He was also a failed land speculator. In the mid-1860s, there was a land bubble in England, very similar to what happened in the United States a decade or so later around railroads. And John Stuart Mill got caught up with it and lost a fair amount of his family's fortune in the course of doing so. He wrote in his diary after it, he said that panics do not destroy capital. They merely reveal the extent to which it has been previously destroyed by its betrayal into hopelessly unproductive works. And I can't think of a better quote that describes what's happened over the course of the last year, is that we have seen a massive destruction of capital, which is, again, affecting all industries because of the availability of capital. And it's happening because that capital had previously been destroyed by its betrayal into a whole host of incredibly unproductive works. The banks have been very creative in finding new and different ways of losing money. Over the course of the last 18 months, the major banks in the US and around the world have written off $1.2 trillion in losses. It's a remarkable amount of money if you begin to think about it. And what's even more remarkable is they're not done. We probably have anywhere from $500 billion to at least another $1 trillion or more left to be written off. And in that process of betraying capital into hopelessly unproductive uses, we have brought the economy into a standstill. We are ultimately a capital economy, and if you destroy capital, you bring the economy to a halt. Well, we've got a plan put forth by Secretary of Treasury Geithner. It's received a good deal of criticism with respect to trying to save the banking system. I think what a lot of people miss about the current plan is that its purpose isn't to necessarily fill the hole in the balance sheets of the banks, which is probably much larger than is politically palatable for the Obama administration to fill. What the plan hopes to do is simply put off the day of reckoning and allow the banks themselves to earn their way out of their problems. If you listen to the statements of the CEOs of Citibank and Wells Fargo and Bank of America in the last couple of weeks, they all said they're making money. This is a great time to be a banker, even for banks that have lost trillions of dollars. You can borrow money for literally nothing. You can lend it out at very favorable rates, and you can make money off of the spread. The risk spreads in the financial markets are at record levels. And so for those businesses that are lending, it's a great time to be a banker. And so the idea, I think, behind the Geithner plan, which I think it ultimately will work, is to give the banks enough time, enough leeway, both by changing the accounting rules and by taking some of the bad assets off their balance sheets, to work their way out of the current problems that they have. And in time, that will happen. We've seen an unbelievable government response to date over the past year. I have to say, I never thought in my lifetime I would see the kind of government intervention into the marketplace that we've seen in the past year. Between the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Treasury, and the Federal Home Administration, they've poured or lent something on the order of $10 trillion into the U.S. economy. It's a phenomenal amount of money. I remember last spring when the first stimulus plan was proposed and passed by the Bush administration, it was $188 billion. That seemed like a big number at the time. And now it pales by comparison. The Federal Reserve has set up a whole alphabet soup of different lending facilities to the banks and to other institutions to buy everything from commercial paper to mortgage-backed securities to even student loans to help facilitate the securitization markets that have failed so terribly. The U.S. Treasury also has its two stimulus plans and the TARP program, again, all aimed at trying to recapitalize the banking system and jumpstart the economy. Within the stimulus program, $787 billion is the largest single spending plan ever passed by Congress and signed by a U.S. president. It's the largest single healthcare spending bill. It's the largest energy spending bill. It's one of the largest tax cuts, all combined into one single bill. Together, these efforts will jumpstart the economy. People should have great confidence that while, in Secretary of Treasury Geithner's own terms, we will waste a lot of money, and I believe him. I think that's a promise that they'll keep. But nonetheless, a lot of that money will be spent appropriately and will have a stimulative effect on the economy. At the same time, the Federal Reserve hasn't been sitting on its laurels in terms of monetary policy. The Fed response to this crisis has been really unprecedented. Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke is a student of the Great Depression. He has said repeatedly that the reason that the Great Depression was the Great Depression was because of the failure of the Federal Reserve, and that they wouldn't do that, they wouldn't commit that same failure this time, and he has certainly been true to his word. He wrote a paper back in 2002 and said that if need be, the Federal Reserve, in order to get liquidity out into the banking system, would fire up its helicopters and go out and dump the money on the country. And so that's where you get the imagery here. What this graphic shows is adjusted bank reserves. It's sort of the reserves that banks have to go out and lend money from. And you can see the little lines across the horizontal axis. We got through the Great Depression with an increase of reserves of almost 100%. We fought World War II with a similar kind of bump up in banking reserves. The past recessions of 80 and in the 70s and 80s, 25, 30% increases in reserves. 9/11, Y2K were also little bumps along that line, and you can see what they've done to date. We're up over 800% from a year ago. This is a phenomenal injection of liquidity into the banking system. I mean, it literally is raining down money on the banks in an attempt to get them to try to start lending. There's a great deal of concern, and I think it's valid, that this increase in liquidity is going to have an inflationary effect on the economy. The focus of the Federal Reserve today is on deflation. They're really very concerned about falling prices, and they should be. Watch out for falling prices is not just a motto of Walmart. It's a concern of the Federal Reserve, because when you get prices falling, that gives consumers an incentive to wait, because things are going to be cheaper tomorrow. And it gives businesses no reason to invest, because the investment property that they're going to make, they can buy it or put it in place tomorrow at a lower cost. And so when you get the economy in a deflationary cycle, it tends to freeze up, and that's what the Fed is really trying to avoid, and they are very clearly, very aggressively trying to address that problem. The issue comes in a couple of years when the economy does begin to catch, when the stimulus begins to work and we begin to see a recovery in the economy. What will happen to all this liquidity? Will the Fed have the political will and backing to withdraw that money? Ben Bernanke made a speech to the National Press Club about a month ago talking about this very issue, saying, don't worry, we've got it, we know it's a problem and we've got it under control. I think the concern is that they may understand the problem. They certainly have the technical capability to withdraw the money. The question is whether they'll have the political backing to do it at the time that they need to. Ultimately, William McChesney Martin said the role of the Fed is to take the punch bowl away when the party just gets going. The current Fed is a little bit like Animal House, where everybody's passed out around the punch bowl and they're putting Everclear into it, hoping to get the party revived again. Kind of a ugly-looking image if you think about it. But the question is, and I think at the end of the day, one of the things that we at Deloitte have come to the conclusion of is that they probably are going to be somewhat lax in extracting some of this liquidity, and we are going to see a much higher level of inflation, sort of late 70s, early 80s kind of inflation in the economy, inflation that we've not seen really in the last 20 years. Well, as I mentioned, I think we are at the beginning of a very significant transformation in the economy that's going to affect a whole host of different fields, but it is definitely going to affect consumer business. First and foremost, the consumer is going to come out of this recession forced to delever, forced to reduce the amount of debt that they're holding, forced to do something that they've not done in a very long time, and that's actually spend less money than they earn. Which I think for a lot of households is going to be a unique and first-time experience. We saw in the last decade a massive ramping up. In fact, I think there's, a massive ramping up of debt. In fact, if you can barely see those red lines, you'll see that we increased the amount of debt load on the consumer in the last 10 years by as much as we had over the previous 40 years. So we went on this orgy of consumer spending fueled largely by debt. And we hit what economists refer to as a Minsky moment, after a guy named Hiram Minsky, where we realized that a lot of this debt isn't going to get repaid. A lot of mortgages were given out to people who basically had the ability to fog a mirror. And that wasn't quite sufficient in terms of repaying a lot of this debt, which is why we're in the problem we are today. And so over the course of the next decade, we are going to see a steady restructuring of the consumer's balance sheet, as this debt gets written off, as some of it gets paid off, as consumers raise their level of savings in order to rebuild their own household balance sheets. And that's going to have a direct impact on consumer spending. On the consumer side, you can see that the effect of that debt, we ramped up consumer spending as a share of GDP from the mid to high 60s up to 72%. Huge increase. I mean, if you think about it, GDP is about $14 trillion. So a 5% increase in the share of GDP is $700 billion. It's a huge increase in consumer spending, sort of over and above the long-term trend of what it should have been, given the mix of what's going on in the economy. Again, we're going to see a retrenching of the consumer sector as that segment begins to contract. That's what's happening today. Is why we're seeing such aggressive response on the part of the federal government to expand spending to, in a sense, take up this slack that's being left by the consumer. At the same time, we're restructuring the U.S. economy, the rest of the global economy that depended on this. I mean, China, if you think China, India, Brazil, a lot of the developing countries who are part of the U.S. supply chain, consumer supply chain, all now see a loss of export growth to the U.S. And so in the same way that we are restructuring our economy to reduce consumer spending, they have to restructure their economy to fill the hole that's left by the loss of exports. And so if you are in the consumer business, the real opportunities are not going to be in the US, and they're not going to be in the developed world. They're increasingly going to be in the developing world. We're going to see a very significant ramping up of consumer-led economic activity in China. In fact, China is going to be kind of the US Wild West frontier, 1950s kind of growth model, I think, for, literally for the life of the careers of you students who are just beginning to start in retail or consumer business today. So my first recommendation to you would be to learn Mandarin. And if you can't learn Mandarin, if that's a bit too much challenge, then Portuguese would probably be a second alternative. Arabic might be a third, because those are the places in the world where we're going to see a dramatic ramping up of the role of the consumer within their individual country economies. This is a very difficult environment. We had what was unquestionably the toughest holiday season in the post-World War II period. We've really never had a time where we've actually seen a sustained decline in top-line retail sales growth, whether it was in non-auto or total retail sales or whatever it was. This has not happened, because in past recessions, those recessions tended to be inflationary phenomena, driven by rising levels of inflation and responses by the Fed to increase interest rates to dampen down demand. So we were still able to get through those environments, through those recessions, with top-line growth still expanding slightly, even though the real volume of business was contracting. This time has been very different. Because of the deflationary impact of the credit crunch, we're seeing top-line growth fall across the country and across businesses, and particularly affecting the retail business. Now, my expectation is that we are going to see a rebound in consumer spending for this holiday season. At the very least, we've got very easy comparisons from a year ago. We've got a reduction in energy prices, which I think is another source of purchasing power for the consumer in non-energy related areas. And we also have the largest tax cut, one of the largest tax cuts in the history of the country, conveniently going into effect. I think it shows a sense of humor on the part of Congress that they started this on April 1st. But nonetheless, that gives the consumer an increase in cash flow into the household sector, notwithstanding the losses of employment, that will allow them to purchase, to increase the pace of purchasing going forward. We're also going through, I think, a very significant demographic change. And what also makes this recession much more significant than past recessions is that when we come out of it, we don't have that really large household segment that is still in the prime of its purchasing and the prime of its career. And so as the baby boom generation ages, as people start hitting their 60s, getting the latest apparel fashion, buying new household goods, buying new cars is not a primary focus. The shift in spending is away from those categories towards healthcare, towards travel, towards services, maybe towards purchases for grandchildren, but it's clearly not going to be in the same pattern, the same mode as what we had in past recoveries because of the shift and change in demographics. The other challenge, I think, for a lot of businesses is that right now the labor markets are very slack, and so and we're seeing businesses shed workers in a very aggressive fashion. But again, if you look at these demographics, what it tells me is that the labor force that's going to be out there for a lot of businesses, and particularly retail, is going to be very challenging. And the talent challenge that so many people think this recession has solved by reducing the demand for talent is going to become much more intense in this recovery than we've ever seen before. What that tells me, again, is that with the demand for talent will come higher wages, and that tends to be inflationary. It's another factor that will work into the inflationary scenario. Oops. One of the other changes that I think we're going to see is over the course of the last 25 years, another big positive for the retail business was an expansion of home size. A lot of people talked about a housing bubble. I think that really kind of misses the point. What we saw was really two things. One was a huge expansion of the size of houses that were being sold. A lot of innovation in terms of financing. What really has gotten us into the financial straits that we're in is that we didn't have so much an asset bubble as a debt bubble. And dealing with a debt bubble is a much more challenging economic phenomenon. We had an asset bubble in 1987. The stock market crashed. Everybody said this is the beginning of the next Great Depression, and then 3 months later, nothing happened. And we realized that it was a non-event. Same thing happened really in 2001. We had a crash of an asset bubble, the NASDAQ bubble. I think, but for 9/11, we probably wouldn't have had a recession then. What makes this so much different is that this isn't an asset bubble, it's a debt bubble. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But smaller home sizes. I think this is coming for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of sort of early baby boomers who are now getting to their 60s don't need large suburban homes. They're concerned about their kids actually coming home, so they want to shrink the size of the place. So, either that or rent out the kids' room. I mean, it's one or the other, given the hard times if you can't sell a house. And so the direction in terms of new houses that are going to be built are going to be much smaller. And so there's going to be less place to put stuff. Again, I think another factor that's going to affect retail spending, particularly with respect to the household. We're also seeing a real change in where people are choosing to live. Two pictures here. One is downtown Chicago. We're seeing a real movement, a continued movement of people back into the inner city. Particularly as they age, as they don't need the large suburban house, they find that they want to be closer to work, closer to where all the cultural activities are. Having a walking lifestyle is very attractive. And again, it reduces the chance of children coming back home. The other place we're seeing people move to is to the exurbs. The picture in the upper right-hand corner is actually my hometown, Steamboat Springs, Colorado. It's about 7,500 people full-time. It's a lovely place to live. We live about 3 blocks off of Main Street. It's a walking pedestrian lifestyle. And the interesting thing about it is that when I go to the airport to fly out, you see sort of two groups of people. You see all the people who are in their ski stuff, and they've got their boots, and they're clunking onto the plane, and you see a lot of people who are business types. Because increasingly, people can work location neutral. They don't have to be located next to the people that they're working because they can live anywhere they choose to. And so in a lot of very high quality lifestyle kind of places, and in Steamboat, it's about 20% of the workforce, don't necessarily earn their living in Steamboat, but live there nonetheless. And we're going to see more of that happen as well. That presents a huge challenge for retailers because the traditional mall-based store misses both of these growth areas, both of these growth opportunities. And the traditional format that many retailers have, either very large boxes or specialty stores, don't fit in either of these environments. I'm sorry, we're not here right now. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. And so I think one of the things that retailers are going to have to really rethink is the real estate strategies that they've operated on that have been so successful over the course of the last 30 years. I think we're also going to see a real rising tide of retail bankruptcy. We've already seen this happen so far. Nothing is more satisfying than seeing your best competitor file for bankruptcy. It's a very satisfying experience. Having worked in a lot of bankruptcy over the course of the years, this has worked out quite well. I think one of the reasons that retail is the dynamic industry it is today is that it allows failure to occur. Failure is a great teacher. I wish we would have more of it in a couple of other industries, but nonetheless, failure really creates managers who focus on the important issues. One of the interesting things, like I said, I've done a number of bankruptcies, and this happens without question. The first statement that comes out of the mouth of management when you go in and say, well, what happened? The first thing they say is, if the banks had only given us more money. It's like, no kidding. Really. It wasn't the fact that you broke 6 banking covenants, 6 loan covenants that might have made them a little wary. No, that had nothing to do with it. They just should have given us more money. We will see more bankruptcy, more consolidation in this industry. The bigger and the strong will get bigger, and the not so strong will go away. I think there are a lot of new constraints in this environment for retailers and for other businesses that they're going to have to deal with. First and foremost, we're going to see a real overhauling of financial regulation, and that's going to have a significant impact on all businesses, but it will also have an impact on retail, because it means that the availability of capital is going to become much more restricted. We're going to expand the scope of who we're going to regulate in the financial services. to include just about everybody who we think of as a financial intermediary. We're going to restrict the capital uses within those companies. We're going to force them to deleverage. We're not going to allow them to take on a lot more debt. All of which means that the availability of capital is going to become much more challenging. That's going to really force retailers in particular to think about how they deploy their capital, how they invest it in stores, particularly how they invest it in inventory. Suppliers are being hit by the same phenomena, and their desire to reduce in a sense, the capital allocation to trade credit is going to become quite intense, simply because the availability of that credit is going to become so much tighter. We're going to see a significant transformation of the energy infrastructure and much higher prices for energy. The drop in energy prices that we've seen over the course of the last year is a temporary phenomenon. We are going to both tax energy more, and it's going to cost a lot more. So that creates, I think, real pressures on retailers, which are essentially distribution companies behind the retail store, to figure out ways to have shorter supply chains, to have greener supply chains, to have more energy efficient supply chains. At the same time, the real opportunities, I think, in fact, a lot of people say, what's the next bubble? We've gone through internet stocks now, and we've gone through housing. I really think the next bubble will be in energy. We're putting $50 billion just this year alone in alternative energy, which is a euphemism for energy that can't compete in the marketplace. But alternative energy to subsidize the creation of green energy. The graphic on the left is the cap and trade proposals that the Obama administration is contemplating. This will represent a $650 billion increase in taxes on energy. And again, will result in a much more bureaucratized market for energy, but also a market for energy that will be much higher priced. We're also going to transform healthcare. I think healthcare represents a huge opportunity. We're talking with a client just yesterday. They were pointing out Walmart and Walgreens going into the healthcare provider business. And we were discussing this as to the impact that it would have on healthcare costs, and I pointed out that the big healthcare costs tend to be in the last year of life, and on kind of the big ticket items. I said, I'm not sure, as much as I like Walgreens, I'd go there for a heart bypass surgery. So, or Walmart for that matter, for that purpose. But nonetheless, again, one of the directions that the Obama administration is going towards is transforming the healthcare industry. And actually, I think this will ultimately be a positive for retail. One of the real challenges that a lot of retailers have is providing healthcare. The cost of healthcare for retail is quite extensive for those who do provide it. It's one of the factors that has made retail a less attractive career for a lot of people because of the lack of healthcare provision by many retail companies. And so changing how healthcare is funded, how healthcare is organized, I think will have a significant impact and a positive impact, in this case, on the retail business. We're also going to see, if you really want to be in a growth business, this is it. Federal government outlays, this is only through December of 2008, up almost 50% from a year ago. This is before we get the stimulus bill. This is before we get the increase in the current budget that's being proposed. Over the course of, if you go back to Ronald Reagan, when Ronald Reagan became president, government spending as a percentage of GDP was about 22%. Over the course of the Reagan administration, the whole sort of war against the federal bureaucracy, he was able to whittle that down to 21%. Under George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton, we actually were able to get that down to about 18.5%. Under George W. Bush, we cranked it back up to 21%. And under President Obama, we're probably going to go up to somewhere between 26 and 28%. So we're seeing a huge expansion of government, both in terms of its oversight of the economy, as well as its actual level of spending. What this also tells me is that at some point in time, we're going to have to pay for some of this, if not all of it, and we are going to see a substantial increase in the level of taxation. And it's not going to be just high net worth individuals, and it's not just going to be corporations, because there's not enough blood in that turnip to be able to fund this level of spending increase. So we're going to see a fairly broad-based increase in the level of taxation. And again, I think that's another longer-term negative for retail. I mentioned earlier the challenge of raising capital. We've seen a huge increase in risk spreads. Great to be a banker, but it's tough to be a business person who needs to go out and raise capital in order to expand the business. And I think that will continue to be the case because of the changes that we're making in the regulatory environment. We're also going to see a real change, I think, in the amount of mall building. Very clearly, we're over-malled today. I wasn't sure whether to spell it M-A-L-L-E-D or M-A-U-L-E-D, and I've finally decided on L-L. But we are certainly have an excess of retail space. Again, I think when you look at the change in where population is actually moving to, it's going to, I think, make the sort of the suburban mall phenomena an even greater challenge. From a mall operator perspective, as well as from the perspective of the retailers who are in those malls. Some 20 years ago, when I worked for another, what at that time was a Big 8 accounting firm, it tells you what's happened to the business now. We're down to the final four. We made a prediction back in the early 1990s about the demalling of America, and I think we were a little early on that call, but I don't think we're too far off. At least we're a lot closer to that today than we were back then. I think we're also going to start rethinking inventory. We've seen obviously a jump up in inventory to sales with the recession. We're in the midst of a very intensive inventory liquidation right now that's in large part is being credit driven. A lack of availability of credit financing is forcing businesses to shrink inventory. But once we get on the other side of this recovery, a lot of this efficiency has been driven by great supply chain systems and investment. Again, very large stores, very efficient operations. And again, I think in much more urban and much more ex-urban environments, we're going to have to rethink how we actually manage inventories in the same way that we've done over the last 20 years to make it much more efficient. We're also going to have to look at this issue of employment. One of the things that really strikes me about retail is that we've now gone a whole decade, June 1999 to today, and actually today the U.S. economy lost 665,000 jobs. I'm sure a lot of them were retail. So we've gone a whole decade with no employment growth, no net employment growth. A lot of this represents a growing efficiency of the business, but a lot of it represents simply the fact that retailers haven't made employment and working in the industry the attractive career that it really needs to be. And so I think the real challenge for the industry is to rethink the whole employment mix. And I think there's a huge opportunity right now because there's such a large pool of talent out there that's unemployed. To really rethink this whole employment issue and to upgrade the quality of employment within the industry. I think we're going to see a lot of changes in terms of the supply chain. Again, if you think about the last 20 years, we've globalized supply chains. We've made them much more expansive. We've brought goods from all four corners of the world. And I think the environment that we're moving into is going to make that a less efficient, a less cost-effective approach to the business. First and foremost, we're seeing a real move against the free trade. In fact, one of the things that really worries me, probably more about the Obama administration than anything, is the kind of pandering to the anti-free trade, the protectionist elements within the Democratic Party. A survey done by Gallup within the past year asked the question in general, do you think that free trade agreements have been a good thing for the U.S.? 57% disagree with that notion. That's, to me, a really frightening statistic. Because one of the factors that really drove the sort of the post-World War II expansion was an expansion of trade. And if we lose this key element of economic dynamism in the global economy, we are really going to be in deep trouble. Again, you can go back to the Great Depression, and one of the key policy errors was for the U.S. to become much more protectionist. But very clearly, if you look at the stimulus bill, there are a number of very protectionist elements within that bill that certainly should be worrying to people in the retail business who are very much dependent on free trade. Secondly, we saw oil prices soar and then plummet. I think we're going to see energy prices go back. They're going to go back both because of an expansion of global demand, but they're also going to go back because we're simply going to tax this stuff a lot more than we do today. We have government entities that are dying for revenues, and energy is a very easy place to raise taxes to try to generate that. So again, I think there'll be a lot of incentive to figure out ways to shorten people's supply chains. We've seen a rebound in the dollar. Largely, the dollar has become a currency of choice for people who are worried about what's going on in the world. It's a safe haven for investors. And yet, if you look over the previous 5 or 6 years, we had had a steady decline in the value of the dollar. When we come out of this recession, we're going to see the dollar continue to go down. We're going to go reassert that downward momentum, largely because of the large budget deficits that we're running, because of the huge inflationary stimulus that's put into the U.S. economy. All of that is going to make the dollar much less attractive, and we're going to begin to see the dollar go down. That's going to make importing foreign goods, again, a little less attractive. It's going to make manufacturing goods here in the United States a little bit more attractive. And when you apply that to the change in energy costs, I think it points to more manufacturing coming back to the United States, more sourcing of goods for retailing being done within the United States. It's been a tough year for profitability. Not very many people are bringing home a whole lot of bacon. This has been probably the most severe profit recession for retail, certainly much more severe than what we saw in the 2001-2002 recession. My own expectation is that by the end of the year, we're going to begin to see this turn around, that the retail business will have right-sided itself in terms of its cost. We'll begin to see a little bit better demand. Inventories will be back in control. And as a result, we'll see an improvement in retail profitability. So last thoughts. There have been a number of times when I've gotten up in the morning and turned my computer on and looked what had happened and looked where financial markets were, and I just wanted to scream. And a couple of times I did, and it really felt good. A little disturbing to the household because it's usually about 6 o'clock in the morning and I'm the only one up at that time. But I want to leave you with a quote from Charles Percy Snow. C.P. Snow, if you don't know him, was probably one of the last great Renaissance men. He was a member of the Manhattan Project. He was a physicist by training, and he was also a great novelist. He has a series called Brothers and Strangers, which actually I started reading when I was in graduate school, and I would certainly recommend it to anybody, any student or any non-student here today, because it really talks about what it's like to work in large bureaucracies and all of the politics that are involved and all of the issues that are involved and the moral dilemmas that are associated with it. It's a fabulous book. And you can see he obviously enjoyed life. He passed away in 1980. But Snow wrote, very late in his life, he wrote, despair is not only a sin, it's also unjustifiable. And I think that certainly applies to the environment that we're in today. This is not the Great Depression. The Great Depression came about because of very bad economic policy. We passed one of the most restrictive trade acts in the history of the country in Smoot-Hawley, and we collapsed global trade. The Hoover administration raised the top marginal tax rate from 25% to 65%. And then the Roosevelt administration figured that 65% wasn't quite punitive enough, and they raised it to 85%. So people who are worried about going from maybe 35 to 39.5 really need to go back and look at what happened in the Depression. And we sat back and watched the banks collapse. 10,000 banks failed in the United States in 1932. And this was before the FDIC. When banks failed in 1932 and you had deposits there, you lost your money. And businesses lost their money. And so that created a huge loss of, a huge contraction in purchasing power and a huge loss of confidence in the economy. We do live in a period of great transformation, and I think within every transformation, it creates enormous opportunities. I think the opportunity to create a new business today is greater than it has been at any time in the last 100 years. The new technologies that are out there, the availability of talent, really makes this an incredible time to be a new entrepreneur. And I think we're going to see out of the turmoil of the last couple of years and the turmoil that will continue for the next couple, a lot of new businesses that will really capture our imaginations in ways that businesses haven't in the past. And lastly, I do think we're going to get a recovery in late 2009. We've been forecasting this for almost a year now. It's based on our reading of the indicators in the credit markets. The credit markets are really the leading indicators for the economy. We have a much steeper yield curve in the Treasury market. We've had significant improvements in terms of risk spreads, and all of that tells us that we should see a recovery. One last thing I would like to ask you to do before I take questions is that when you get done here today, particularly you who are not students, you're kind of high end, please, we at Deloitte work with a lot of different retailers. Go out and buy something. I know there's a client of ours who could really use your business, and it could certainly help my forecast. Thank you very much. Now, I've been blabbering on here for, 40 minutes. I'll be happy to take any questions that anybody might have about what I said or maybe some things that I didn't say. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, the question is, how do I see the real estate market? Are you talking about the residential housing or commercial real estate? Residential housing. We're already starting to see some hopeful signs within the residential housing market. We've seen a little, we had a month of pickup in sales. Pending home index put up by the National Association of Retailers was up. We've got mortgage rates at all-time record lows. Housing affordability is at an all-time record high. All of that, and we've seen inventories come down, which I think is actually the key, is that getting the level of inventories down will reduce the downward pressure on prices. My own expectation is that we'll probably see a stabilization in housing towards the end of the year. We'll first see housing prices stop falling. We're down 20% from a year ago, I think about 28% from the peak. We probably have another 5 to maybe 10% to fall before we hit the actual bottom. But I would see the housing market actually being one of the first sectors. It's generally a leading sector in the economy, and I think that will be the case this time. You also have to remember there's an enormous amount of pent-up demand within housing. I mean, we've in a sense been in a decline in the housing market now for 5 years. The amount of housing that we've been building for the last 2 years is significantly less than the demand for housing. So what we need is a mortgage market that actually works, and we're slowly getting to that with what the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are doing in terms of the bank rescue programs. And I think the combination of those factors of that pent-up demand, of the increased availability for mortgages and the huge availability for affordability of housing tells me that we're going to see some stabilization there and a recovery again before the end of the year. Commercial real estate, I think, is a different issue. Commercial real estate tends to lag the economy. I think it's probably got at least another year of pain and misery before they begin to see a bottom. Yes, sir. How government policy will have a positive impact on innovation at the government level? That's a great question. I'm not sure I have a really solid answer for it. And I have to say, it's actually not a question that usually most of the questions that I get are ones that I've gotten, I can just sort of, rotely give you an answer to it. So I have to think about this one, which is always difficult on one's feet. I don't think it's the, government. The best thing you can hope for government is that it gets out of the way in terms of entrepreneurship. And a lot of what we've seen being proposed actually over the course of the past year would lead me to believe that they're going to, that it's somewhat discouraging to entrepreneurship. We're talking about significantly higher levels of taxes for small businesses, which would certainly hit entrepreneurship. But I guess I don't see government as the defining factor here in terms of the sort of the marketplace for entrepreneurship. I think I go back to Joseph Schumpeter, the whole idea of creative destruction. We've had the destruction side very clearly over the course of, and that's really what a recession is all about. And that destruction, I think, creates then the opportunity for entrepreneurship, kind of regardless of what government is doing. If you do look at the stimulus bill, though, there is a huge amount of money for research. Again, it's not only the largest healthcare and energy bill passed, it's also one of the largest research bills ever passed. So in that sense, it is putting money into sort of scientific research, some of which hopefully will lead to more products and innovation down the road. Yes, sir.
I'd like to go back for a minute to the tax comments you made, because I happen to agree with you. I don't think that there is enough blood in the turnip at the top tax or top earners to pay for everything that we're spending. So do you believe that the administration will use marginal tax rate increases on a broader group of people, especially after the president-elect has said he doesn't want to do that? Or do you think they'll do things like we're seeing with significant increases in tobacco taxes, energy taxes? And I raise that question because if it's in your marginal rate and you set your withholdings right, it can be an every paycheck activity, or it can be a once-a-year deal in April. Right. That doesn't have the same psychological impact on you as a consumer. If it's in almost like a product sales tax, which is what my concern is, it hits you right now. Right. What do you think the government's going to do to pay for all this?
I don't. The question is, how are they going to get the blood out of the other turnip, in a sense? And I don't think they're going to raise personal income taxes certainly not on the bottom 50% of the income distribution. What I think they'll do is they'll raise, as you mentioned, excise taxes, energy taxes. I think will be a big one. They'll probably raise Social Security taxes. They'll raise taxes on tobacco, on alcohol. I think there's a increasing chance of a value-added tax, which is something I never thought we would see in this country. But the person who they want to put in charge of sort of tax policy for the Treasury has actually been an advocate for value-added taxes. So I think, and that's a big revenue. You don't have to have much of that to really generate a huge amount of revenue. So I think that's certainly a possibility too. We'll go over to this side of the room. Yes.
First of all, I'd like to say finding an economist with a sense of humor these days is very refreshing.
Well, with this economy, you have to have a sense of humor.
The question is, given your statement or prediction that there'll be a recovery or a turnaround beginning this year, how long a time period would you say it would take for the job retooling of the American worker to get back to a two-job family again?
Yeah, I think that's going to take a lot longer. The labor market tends to lag the overall economy. And particularly if you look at the last two recoveries, that we've been very slow to build jobs back. Businesses, once they go through the process of downsizing, and the pain that's associated with that, really are very slow to hire people back. So, that could be before we get back to the levels of employment that we were, 2 years ago. I think it could be 2 years or more. And I think you bring up a second issue though about the whole retooling of the labor force. I mean that's a much longer term process. There is a fair amount of money in the president's stimulus bill and budget for worker retraining, but the government doesn't have a terribly good track record in terms of the performance of those kinds of programs. So I think we're, for places like Michigan and a lot of the auto workers who are very clearly have either lost their jobs or will lose their jobs, I'm afraid the outlook is not terribly bright. So I think I'm about to get the hook here. So I'm going to say thank you very much.